Hello. How are you guys? How was your day? I spent my day making videos for you about the four questions, and then this finally, whoo, last video for me is about the discussion board. And I think it's the fifth different shirt I've worn today. So, new shirt for every video. But we're back to the cereal boxes where, I just feel comfortable and at home. Also, dang, what is in the air? Pollens are driving me crazy today. I don't think I'm gonna be okay. But you know what else was not okay? The Vietnam War. It's way worse than Holland's because people were protesting it. And more people were protesting the Vietnam conflict than you will find in Michigan, protesting their governor, or downtown Austin. God, goodness. People protesting our governor because they think he's too liberal? What in the world? Virus is getting to us, isn't it? All right, so the discussion board question is about the anti war movement. And I really think the best source that I gave you is probably that video, that Mike Wallace 20th century video. Now, I know it's kind of long, but again, you're quarantined. What are you going to do? It's about 20 minutes, maybe 24 minutes. Now, here's a problem. This is not, I repeat, not a video that you should be watching with your little brothers and sisters around. No, no, no. That video has war footage. One of the things that's very different about the Vietnam conflict, and in part why there was so much protest against it, it's really the first televised war. So there were news reporters who were just there and filming, and we had constant feed, live feed cameras there as well. So there were, oh goodness, I think some of the worst moments that I had as a teacher probably were around how I taught the Vietnam conflict. There was a year that I showed one of those 20th century kind of videos where they just showed video clips, and there was a soldier who just tossed another guy's bloody leg somewhere. That was not cool. And then one year we decided we would have Vietnam veterans come in and talk to the students, and that thing was real, but that was pretty bad. So, yeah, they came in combat gear and with fake weapons, as I recall. And it seems to me like the police were called by some parents on the way in. So it was not my best day of teaching. Honestly, it wasn't my worst either. We'll talk about that later. But Vietnam conflict. Now, at first, pretty much everybody's okay with the Vietnam War because, evil, godless communists, they have to be stopped. Domino theory, I'd rather fight them over there than fight them over here. But as time went along, we felt differently about it. And the video really does a good job of talking about that. Your book doesn't do a bad job, it's just a really brief job, and it's a fairly important topic. So, in your book, it's going to talk about the SDS, which is Students for Democratic Society, and these are going to be West Coast kind of dudes, UCal Berkeley, who are going to lead sit-ins and protests against the war. And you'll see that spread a little bit throughout the country on college campuses. But you have to remember, most people didn't go to college during this time period, and people who were going to college were going to get automatic deferments from the draft. So they're not going to Vietnam. So their audience was people who agreed with them. Now, as time went along and the war got bigger and more people were either volunteering or then as we get into the later 60s getting drafted, it becomes different because what we notice is the draft laws are not fair. So there were lots of ways to get out of being drafted. Going to college was notably one, but also being married or having a relative on the draft board or being politically connected. You'll notice that most of the political candidates for president of a generation or so ago somehow got out of service in the Vietnam conflict. George Bush did, and Al Gore. Al Gore went, but he was a reporter. John Kerry went and then came back and threw his medals away. You'll see them interview him, or you'll hear them interview him in the Mike Wallace video. If you're wondering, like, who the heck is John Kerry? He was Secretary of State for a while. under the Obama administration and a candidate for president um, at one point as well. George Bush served in the National Guard, and Bill Clinton did some. Yeah, he went to. He was a Rhodes Scholar. That's what he was. He was a Rhodes Scholar. So if you were connected, you could get out of military service. The other thing we noticed is that people who were drafted were disproportionately poor, disproportionately minority. And the other thing we'll notice is that people who volunteer for the military are also disproportionately poor, disproportionately Southern as well, and Midwestern, but mostly Southern in the modern era. So moderately interesting stuff. Peeking at the book, it does talk a little bit about the counterculture and talks about how music reflects the anti-draft movement. You'll see that in the video as well. There's a pretty good list of stuff in the timeline that I think will help you too. If I were you, see, if I'm writing this answer, I'm probably first talking about how protests are small and on college campuses and pretty much ignored by the general public. And people thought of protesters as being very unpatriotic. They did. It's like, just a bunch of commie sympathizers, bunch of wimpy kids, bunch of pot smoking liberals, that sort of thing. Um, as we get closer to 1968, where you have the highest number of folks involved in the draft and actually in country in Vietnam, you'll start to see larger protests. I think it's 67 where you've got the March to the UN that's led by Martin Luther King Jr. Now, that's a fairly big named guy. So when you've got Dr. King protesting the draft, he's a fairly well respected, nonviolent, he's a Baptist minister from the South. Oh my goodness. And nobody was a better speaker than he was. So that lends a lot of credibility to the movement, but also gets an FBI guy following Martin Luther King Jr. everywhere he goes. That's also how we find out that Dr. King's doing some stuff. I don't want to talk about that in this video, but we'll talk about the stuff later on. Um, the other person who really notably protests the Vietnam conflict is Muhammad Ali. Perhaps you've heard of him. He's a fairly famous boxer, heavyweight champion from Louisville, Kentucky. And he had gotten drafted as a heavyweight champion boxer. And he decided, with some help from a spiritual advisor, Malcolm X, he had decided that he would resist the draft because he didn't believe that a practicing Muslim should go into war. And he also thought, along with many, many civil rights leaders, that it didn't make sense to go fight against an injustice overseas when we couldn't solve the injustices at home. So, one of the things that I've always thought was pretty admirable and notable, I know, an opinion about Muhammad Ali was that he didn't run off to Canada or Mexico. He went to the draft board and said, "Hey, I'm not going." And, he was upfront and honest about it. Now, what was the book that, yeah, book review due May 1st. You've still got a couple weeks, so there's time. This book, if you're can I be sexist? If you're a dude and you like sports where people beat the crap out of each other, there's a book called Ghosts of Manila, and it ties in Muhammad Ali's boxing career with the anti-war movement and brings in Joe Frazier as well. I think it's fascinating. There was, oh goodness, as high school teachers, we always had to do book reviews, and I worked with coaches because, it's the history department. And we would have to pick books, and it was really hard to find a book that we all thought would be worth reading. So one year I suggested Ghosts of Manila, and they all read it and thought it was the greatest book because it's very much sports related, but also ties into politics. So Ghosts of Manila, and I think the author's name is Mark Kram, Kram. I know, it sounds weird. Sports writer, though. Really interesting book. I think he worked for Sports Illustrated for a long time. But it talks about how people who were opposed to the Vietnam conflict really became Muhammad Ali fans. And people who were in favor of the Vietnam conflict became Joe Frazier fans because Joe Frazier did not resist the draft and fought and served in the military, or excuse me, served in the military. So he fought as well. I don't mean that he didn't, but um, and those two had 3 boxing matches, and it talks about how the press and different political groups followed and approved of one more than the other. I think it's pretty fascinating stuff. All right, so we got Muhammad Ali, we got Martin Luther King Jr. Oh, you're also going to see a lot of protests after 68 that are related to Vietnam. I think the most notable ones are Jackson State in Mississippi and Kent State in Ohio. And these are student protests of the Vietnam conflict after the Nixon presidency began. And Nixon decided that one of the ways to get North Vietnam to come to the negotiating table was to bomb Cambodia. And the UN had said that there shouldn't be any fighting in Laos and Cambodia, but Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of North Vietnam, sent supply trails and troop movements through Laos and Cambodia. So the United States thought, oh my gosh, that's not fair. So we are going to bomb the daylights out of those countries. And we did. And we killed lots of folks. I have had an uncle, my Uncle Heinz, guess what country he's from, who was a member of the United States Air Force, very proud member of the United States Air Force. And he served 4 tours in Vietnam. One of them was in Laos. Now, Laos is Laos, if you're wondering, like, what is she saying? But because we technically weren't there, my uncle never got service credit for that tour, and he just didn't care. It's like, I'm proud, that's what I was supposed to do, so I did it. But one of the things that you'll notice as we get farther in the war effort, more and more people are opposed to it because we've seen more of it, more people are involved, we've been in it longer, we don't seem to have a strategy or a goal, and we don't really seem to have the ability to win a conflict in a very small country. So when Nixon says that one of the things he's going to do is get us out of Vietnam with honor, it's part of one of many, part of the reason that he gets elected. Now, his strategy is bombing the daylights out of Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, which doesn't go over well because it's primarily a civilian bombing. But he will announce that we have peace talks and eventually we'll sign a peace treaty. And the truth is, by the time we're done, we're just glad we're out. Now, if you're wondering, did we win the Vietnam conflict? No, we did not. And that's a difficult thing for people in the United States to talk about because we're the greatest and we can win any war that we want to. But that was a very unusual conflict. Also, I do remember reading lots of stories about combat veterans who would come back and people would protest against them, give them a hard time, way more than give them a hard time, shoot at them, um, call them names. The book and the video will talk about the anti-LBJ chants. And the reason that LBJ doesn't run for another term, he says, I will not seek nor will I accept the Democratic Party nomination for president in 1968, is he's overwhelmed by how poorly things are going in Vietnam. So all right, so your question again was discuss how successful the anti-war movement was in changing the course of the war, what methods were used, how did the movement view freedom and the war, and make sure that you talk about the intersection of the civil rights movement with the anti-war movement, because the idea that people who were poor, people who were of color, were much more disproportionately affected by the draft is statistically viable. You can prove that. So it's definitely worth discussing. All right. Again, if you have any questions, please email me during the week and I'll try to be good about getting back to you. Also, I can tell when you're looking at videos and when you're accessing the assignments, and it looks like a lot of you are waiting until Thursday and Friday. So if you can maybe start a little sooner, I think it'll be easier for you. And I know I've mentioned this before, but routine, oh my goodness. I know this coronavirus pandemic thing is it's a chore and it's horrible, and I know, and I'm so sorry for you because I know you'd rather be at school hanging with your friends and, even at Glen where who's out in the hallways. Uh, I shouldn't I won't even say because I was joking when I said that in class. But and I know some of you girls, you're shopping online. I know what you're doing. But I know you miss the routine of school, so you have to create your own routine. And if you can work a little bit every day, it'll be easier for you. And honestly, it's better for you to have something to do each day. And do nice things as well. Help the neighbors if you can. Do the yard work for the old lady who, can't do her own yard work. I'm not talking about me. Don't even act like that. All right. But do a good deed as well, and you'll feel better. It'll be good. Okay, don't forget to go outside unless you're like me, and then it makes your allergies a little nutty. All right. So email me if you have questions. I hope everything's going okay for you. And put in some specific details. Look at that video. I think it'll help. All right, I'm done. All right. It was good to see you guys today. Hope you have a very nice evening. Take care of yourselves. Bye.